Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. Well, you braved the elements again. Anyway, we're glad the weather hasn't yet begun, and we'll make sure that the event here this afternoon will be stimulating, energizing, and you'll be ready to take on anything after 5:30 today. Welcome to the United States Institute of Peace. My name is Kathleen Keenest. I direct the Center for Gender and Peace Building Center here at USIP. Today's event marks the first anniversary of the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. It's a long title, so the nickname is the U.S. NAP. Just in case you hear that a lot today, that's insider language for that very long title, so the U.S. NAP. Just over a year ago, President Obama signed an executive order directing the implementation of the first ever U.S. NAP on this topic. With that signature, the U.S. administration demonstrated its commitment to women, peace, and security issues as vital U.S. security writ large interests. The U.S. NAP recognizes and affirms that to be effective, our policies must engage women as equal partners in conflict prevention and peace building, and ensure their protection from violence. Over the past year, the U.S. government has made commendable progress toward implementing this plan both domestically in the U.S. agencies and globally, including through our embassies and in conflict and post-conflict settings. Today's event is significant because it represents the important community of actors who all have been committed to this agenda, what we call Women, Peace, and Security, or another insider acronym, WPS. This extraordinary and diverse coalition of actors bridges government and civil society and has established a network through which a wealth of experiences and knowledge can be shared. Within the government, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has been instrumental in putting women, peace, and security on our agenda. She has also been at the forefront of encouraging engagement between our government and civil society. So today, here in Washington, we like to think we're walking the talk, so to speak, because one of our goals today in this panel discussion is to continue to build bridges between government and civil society. And today we're doing that again in Washington. Before we begin our panel discussion here, and I introduce our distinguished panelists who have joined us, I would like to take 1 minute to introduce our new Executive Vice President, Kristen Lord, who began just 3 days ago. We are very excited to have such a strong leader for women, peace, and security here at USIP. Dr. Lord was the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for New American Security, otherwise known as CNAS, where she oversaw the center's research and served as one of the 3 members of the center's leadership team. She also has been a fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies Program and Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. She has been served as the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow and Special Advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs. She also has been a part of civil society in her role at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, including as Associate Dean for Strategy, Research, and External Relations. Kristen, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Kathleen. I will be very brief, which is not only easy on your first day, on your third day, I think it's judicious as well. I want to echo Kathleen's welcome to all of you and thank you for all you do to advance the women, peace, and security agenda in support of U.S. government and civil society actors around the world. I also want to confirm USIP's commitment to work on the efforts of the US NAP, which I've just learned how to say, and to congratulate the US government and US Civil Society Working Group on their contributions to that effort. I want to take this opportunity to thank Kathleen and her team for all you do here to advance these important issues. And then last, I'd like to wish you all a very productive afternoon and turn it back to Kathleen. So thank you all for coming.
I think my mic is on. Now I'm going to shift hats here and become moderator. Can you hear me? Yes.
No.
Okay.
No.
No?
More no's than yes.
Oh,
Yes, it's
can hear
okay.
me.
All right. All right. Well, I'd like to recognize now our panelists. And first, I'm going to introduce to you our U.S. government panelists. And I know you might be wondering, we're very happy, though, to have Victoria Holt, who is, for a few minutes anyway, been willing to step in for Ambassador Milan Verveer. Tori is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. We're happy to have you on board this today. In addition, we have William Lietzau, who I was asking about what title here, and he prefers Bill. Is that all right? Thank you very much. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense at the U.S. Department of Defense. Welcome. And Rob Brzezinski, who has played an integral role in the interagency coordination of the U.S. NAP, is here representing the National Security Council. And Carla Capel at the U.S. Agency of International Development is here in her capacity. Carla is one of these people who has had many lives, and she knows the civil society world very well, and now in her role as Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. So we want to welcome each of you, and we look forward to your opening remarks. And before I move forward, I would like to also recognize the Civil Society Working Group, and we have 3 members of the working group who are joining us here today. We have Sanam Anderlini, who is the co-founder of International Civil Society Action Network. You might want to, thank you. Joan Timoney, who is the Director of External Relations for the Women's Refugee Commission. And Chantal Dioula-Udrat, who is the Executive Director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, otherwise known as SIPRI, here in the United States, North America. I want to take just another minute and recognize the Civil Society Working Group, and I think many of them are here today, and you will meet them after the event or the panel discussion out in the Great Hall. I think we have 24 tables, and this is an opportunity for you to really see the wealth of information and knowledge in our civil society actors. And so if I could just ask you all to stand for a minute. They were instrumental in organizing today's event. Oh, thank you. And so I've asked each of our panelists if they would help set the scene as to what is the U.S. National Action Plan, how does it connect to the UN Resolution 1325 and the many other resolutions associated in that family, and to speak in very concrete terms about how the implementation is going in either each of their agencies or within the perspective of civil society. And so we have them intermingled here as a way to really show the type of collaboration and cooperation that has happened over the last several years around the U.S. National Action Plan. And to set the scene, I've asked Sanam Anderlini, who many of you may know, has been looking at this and working on this agenda for your whole life, perhaps.
18,
about 20 years.
No, since 1996.
So, Sanam, if you could kick off the brief remarks.
Thank you.
And after the brief remarks, we will open it up for conversation and Q&A. Please.
Thank you. Wow, what a crowd. Kathleen asked me to speak for 4 minutes, but I'm Iranian, so I was like, cultural sensitivity, a little bit of compromise, I'll speak for 10 and we'll be... No, so I wanted to give you a brief, just a sense of where civil society fits into this agenda. And basically, the key point is actually civil society has been the engine and the drive behind this from the very, very beginning, globally working at local levels, national levels, internationally, in conflict zones. This is, and one of the things I want to make sure to sort of reiterate is that this isn't really coming from Western countries or Western agenda. It came from women in conflict zones who were experiencing war and insurgency and the types of issues that in the US context we now see in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They were seeing it in the 1990s post-Cold War. So it was the experiences of women that drove us to this agenda. And in a sense, it was a paradigm shift, primarily to do with the fact that we were seeing a changed nature of conflict in the 1990s, the sort of proliferation of non-state armed actors out there, and the targeting of civilians. So the theater of war was changing. The civilians were actually being deliberately targeted in cases like Bosnia and Rwanda. We were seeing women's bodies literally being the front lines in some of the ethnic wars and so forth. And the sort of the flip side of that coin was also the emergence of non-state, non-armed actors, which is where the civil society comes in responding to those and trying to bring back peace and normalcy and fighting for a sort of protection of their communities and basic rights at a time when the international community really wasn't present because our systems weren't in place to deal with civil wars and internal conflicts. So civil society has been behind this, and women have been at the center of this because that's where we see women emerging as leaders from the very, very beginning. The issue was that we didn't have an international framework for recognizing the work of non-armed, non-state actors. So we've moved in the sense that if you are armed and you become really, really violent and you're a spoiler, we will invite you to the table, whether you're the LRA in Uganda, the Taliban, and so forth. However, if you are providing shelter for thousands of people, doing reconciliation work across communities, holding your government accountable for corruption and so forth, we still say, where are you, and who are you, and so forth. This agenda was brought about to the Security Council with the view that we as civil society have a voice, and not only we have a voice, we have solutions that are important, and the reality is that the situations we're dealing with have become so complex that 20th century methods and systems and institutions that were developed to deal with interstate wars are really not able to deal with this type of conflict and this type of environment. That's really where the thrust of this agenda comes from. Recognizing that actually human rights is really central to the notion of peace and security, and women's right is integral to that. So that's the story behind the role of civil society. I'll be honest with you, it wasn't that the Security Council was enlightened one moment and said, we're going to have a resolution. As global civil society, we mobilized, we drafted the first resolution, we pushed for it, and we understood that it was a partnership between civil society, government, and multilateral institutions. And I think that in the US context, we've seen this as well, that we wouldn't have had a US National Action Plan if it hadn't been for civil society advocating for it very strongly. And we still see the importance of partnership and equal sort of mutual respect and division of labor, in a sense, based on comparative advantages. Because in civil society, we can say things, we have more agility, we can do things, we have access to people and places that maybe governments don't. And this is the same for our partners on the ground, whether it's in Syria or Afghanistan or Iraq or any of the countries that we're working with. And I'll just end with a couple of things, that our role as civil society, as we work with government, and we want governments to do better and be more inclusive and bring our voices and really the solutions to the table, we're also going to be critical and constructive, and probably critically constructive, if you want, of how government does its work moving forward. A lot of this agenda up to now has been about what's the input, what are we doing, what reports are we putting, what institutions or what capacities are we creating for ourselves here. We haven't looked at the impact and the outcomes of our work. And I think the next year and moving forward, our role from civil society is going to be bringing a level of accountability, asking for real-time application of these principles to as I said, in the case of Syria, or in the case of the Afghan peace process, and other places of where are these voices, and are we working with them? And I'll, two things. I think for those of us who work with women on the ground in conflict areas, our rationale, our constituency, our raison d'etre is not what the Security Council says or what the US government says, frankly. Our concern is the people on the ground. It's the women and men, the children on the ground, and whether the work that we're doing here is making their lives better. That's at the end of the day how we have to judge ourselves. But I also see this framework, which is really about bringing the voices of the silent majority, if you want, the people who really want peace, who are vested in peacemaking, who have creative ways of approaching things, have no exit strategy in the countries where they're working, have incredible courage and resilience, that we're bringing that social capital to the table to deal with the challenges that we're faced with. And one can look at this agenda and say it's a national action plan and it's another box that we have to tick and it's another bureaucratic burden. Or we can look at this agenda and it's a pretty broad, it's a very good framework and a lot of guidance that goes with it, and say this is actually a tool that we can be using looking forward in terms of how we engage with the world and within our own institutions to bring about the peace that we want. So I hope that in the spirit of partnership for this meeting, certainly it's great to have everybody here, but to think of this not as a burden, but really as an important resource moving forward. Thank you. Did I do 4 minutes?
That was excellent. You set a great pace and also added very important context to the story here that has been going on for quite some time behind the scenes. Tori, would you like to talk about what has been happening at the State Department and some of the concrete actions that have happened over the last several years as a result of this?
I'm happy to, and just a note of explanation, I am not Ambassador Verveer, but it's a good sign that I could be called within an hour to show up. It shows how integrated we are, and also shows how important her role is. She's literally with the Secretary of State. It's the Secretary's last week, so I think it's an interesting thing that all of us know each other fairly well, because we've been spending time together, not just writing plans, but really thinking about how do you implement the spirit of what 1325 and all the other Security Council resolutions has launched us on. And my day job is actually to be the deputy who worries about the Security Council agenda. So to me, this has a very added level of importance, that resolutions are not successful if they're just, frankly, pretty on paper. Our whole goal is to make them implementable. So to have the kind of intellectual capital and civic engagement in this has been an extraordinary thing to watch. It gives us a lot more confidence that we'll be able to actually carry these things out across our strategic, our bilateral, our multilateral enterprise of diplomacy. And just to remind ourselves, I'm always struck, the Secretary constantly says, this is not just a woman's issue. So in looking back over the last year, maybe I'll just hit a few highlights. Particularly within State Department, we talk about the 3 Ps and the 2 Rs, if I get it right. The first one, obviously, is participation. And the core goal there is to know that when women are equal participants in conflict resolution, their unique experiences and contributions lead to improved outcomes. Simply put, we want more women at the table. Frankly, I'd say we also want more women outside the door, banging on the door, and we want their insight in the first place. In other words, if you ignore a whole chunk of the population who has insights into how to deal with either conflict or post-conflict environments, at a fundamental level, you're missing an analysis that's key to finding and unlocking the right solution. So for us, that has been cross-cutting. Some of it's new initiatives, but some of it's the daily business of diplomacy. I have been in the room when, at least in one case, we were talking about a vexing crisis, and someone said, hey, if we're inviting people to the table, where are the women? And in real time, you saw the head swivel and say, yes, that's right. I can give you some examples. In both Sudan and South Sudan, our efforts to bring people to the table included women. And I also know from the work in Afghanistan, we've been able to have women at the same table as the Taliban, which is probably a bit breathtaking if you were there in the room. We've been able to include women in high-level international conferences regarding the future security and economic development of Afghanistan as well, including the 2012 Tokyo Conference and the 2012 NATO Chicago Summit. But beyond participation, and deeply linked to it, is the second P, which is protection. And as my colleague has just mentioned, a lot of the goal here is to prevent vulnerable populations, particularly women and children, from constantly being affected both in a conflict and after a conflict. And how do you unpack that? How do you actually get ahead to prevent, respond to, and then support accountability for those who could be victims of violence? That includes men and boys as well. But by involving women, you have a better chance of understanding the drivers of the conflict in the first place and hopefully prevent. On the prevention side, we have supported pre-deployment training, for example, for sexual and gender-based violence or gender violence in general, both for our own selves but also for UN peacekeepers. Some really cutting-edge work that I would give some credit to the team here for really promoting and putting forward. We've also included commitments to prevent trafficking in persons and other initiatives where we look beyond just the traditional maybe WPS, Women, Peace, Security agenda. How do we touch other initiatives that also look at vulnerable populations? There's been capacity building in the health, legal, and accountability fields to also encourage and support prosecutions of those who do perpetuate such violence, because we know that accountability sends a message sometimes, even though after the fact you wish you had stopped it, even if we can't, that such justice in local societies and in key countries is important. And as a personal note, I've had too many ambassadors come to my office and say, I'm in a post-conflict environment, but we still have gender and sexual violence. What do I do? And there's no easy answer, but the fact that they are asking that question is a really important start to a conversation. And that might just be one theme I'd have here, is that this is an ongoing conversation. We're not done, we are still starting. Third P, prevention. And this is really the one that I think grabs all our hearts. If women are an underutilized resource when it comes to conflict prevention, then we will not do as well. But when they are engaged in understanding what's going on in front of them, whether it's trying to fight terrorism or human rights abuses, bring an end to a conflict or support a peace deal, their insights and knowledge are incredibly effective. Just another personal insight. I know from my world where we deal with peacekeeping missions, we've had more increase on trying to work with women to when they go out to the markets or the fields. But this is also because they know who might attack them where. And that gives you an extra level of analysis into the dynamics of a conflict that can be integrated back into our political strategies. We at State have also worked on countering violent extremism. There's been local grant making to communities to bring in women's insights into those and prevent radicalization, to empower women's voices, and also partnering with local organizations such as in Burma, where the minority groups often, or when they are under attack, involving women's communities, and this can help us unpack that conflict. Fourth and not least is the relief and recovery agenda. We know that in crisis and conflict, that women's perspectives are crucial in ensuring that relief and recovery assistance addresses the needs of the entire affected population. This again has led us to support training for those response and recovery teams before they go out, to understand what gender expertise is available to them and how they can use that and integrate it into U.S. government relief and recovery efforts. This is just a very short overview. I think you will get headlines from us occasionally about what we're doing both at State but across the interagency as initiatives. But I think some of the proof of the work is in the quiet day-to-day, the diplomacy, the training, the engagement, what our embassies use, what our AIT teams use, and that people can be called within an hour to show up and talk about it because they already know about it and they've already been working on it. So hopefully behind me there's another 100 people at State who could be sitting in this chair. Anyway, thank you for the chance to speak today, and Ambassador Verveer will be with us, I hope, shortly.
Tori, thank you very much, and thank you for the cogent remarks. I like that. Implement the spirit, and I think, as you said, just asking the question exposes and begins to say things are changing as a result of this policy. I'm now going to turn to our Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Bill. Please.
Thanks, Kathleen, and thanks to USIP for inviting me here. It's kind of special to be on Kristen's third day on the job, too, because I have my notes on the first piece of paper she had on her new desk. Apparently, she lent to me when I asked for a piece of paper. So this is an honor. I also will say DOD's perspective, which is what I'll try to give you quickly, but hopefully more so in the dialogue that follows, is different for purposes of questions. We're the bit player. We only have 18 of the 80 actions, so most of your questions should go elsewhere. On a personal level, I will also...
He has something we don't.
I'll also note that as I'm sitting among people who've been described as working on this for the better part of their lives, in fact, Kathleen just described Sanam as having been doing this all of her life, which I suddenly feel very inadequate. My first involvement in this, when I thought about it was I sat through the graduation at the Naval Academy of the first woman to graduate as I was there as a student. Then I lapsed into a period of desuetude where I didn't deal with women, peace, and security for the next 30 years. Until my daughter, who is now a lieutenant in the Marine Corps, had to be sworn in as an officer and came to me to show me the jobs she could choose as a Marine Corps officer. And with a background in the Marine Corps, she was asking me, what kind of job do I want to look at? And I had never taken the time to contemplate the fact that combat exclusions and other things limited the jobs that she could work on. So I had to work through the list with her, and wow, I didn't realize there were that many things you couldn't do. That was my second involvement, and my third involvement was when I was told, hey, you know, you're in charge of this National Action Plan. And get on that. So that has, but I share that with you because it's a different perspective, but I think it's also an important perspective. I think this National Action Plan, there's a lot of people who have it within DoD, and I think that's a good and healthy thing. I think the time is exactly right for how we implemented this. For instance, I guess I'm starting with a potential negative, but some might notice, oh, of the 37 countries that have national action plans, we were the 36th to develop ours. And if you looked at things on a linear scale, you might say, well, you should have done it sooner. And can't we perhaps move faster in implementing some of the objectives here? And I'll say from a DoD perspective, when we really look at what we want to accomplish, I think it's going very well. I think the National Action Plan gave us a focused attention over the last year. We have some specific examples. In fact, that's all that I have on my notes and I'll share a couple of them. What I'm leading to is I think there's something more important than specific things we've done because we had an action listed in a National Action Plan that led us to do it. But for instance, our combatant commands have all started building this into their programs, into their campaign plans to the extent they have them into country plans. Our schools have started working on curricula that we'll add here. Our regional centers are working the issues. We have little, small anecdotal experiences like in AFRICOM. We had a conference on sexual and gender violence issues in Ghana. We have what they call the 1+1 program, where in other training events, if a country is able to nominate a woman to a leadership position that would go to that training, then they get an extra seat at the training, which incentivizes them to do that. Little examples like that, I won't go through the list. The Asia Pacific Center has recently created a fellowship for women, peace, and security that's had a number of graduates. Our Defense Institute for International Legal Studies has embraced a few curricula elements that come out of the National Action Plan that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And I could go on and on with specific examples. I guess I wouldn't want our focus to be there, in that I wouldn't want to claim that it's the National Action Plan that caused us to do things we otherwise wouldn't do. I think what's important about our implementation of it, and in some ways from a DoD perspective, where the timing of the US government's decision to make a commitment to this, for us, it's in the crucible of warfare. We were in the midst of armed conflict as we were saying that this is something we need to do. For us, it's not just about equal rights, though that's clearly a component to the entirety of what we're doing, but it's a component to our national security. So far, our focus is what gives us the peaceful society that we want to live in. What helps us to sustain that peace, and what helps us to build it when we don't have it. I recently, in other pieces of my job, I host the Worldwide Detainee Conference. That sounds like a different subject, but it is a different subject. But during that conference, we had one of our top special operations commanders speaking to the group, and he was asked, what's going to change as we shift out of Afghanistan and our focus goes to other parts of the world? What difficulties do you see? And it was interesting that one of the first things he said was, well, I have to figure out how we're going to be able to keep the female engagement teams that we currently have access to in Afghanistan, because they're not part of our normal, group of people that we can tap into in other operations. It's a special thing that we've created in Afghanistan. It wasn't created because of the National Action Plan. It was created because that's what we need to win the war. And now actually there's an easier answer because of Secretary Panetta's announcement a few days ago. He'll have less problem solving that one as we shift out of Afghanistan. But the point is, all these things are happening at the same time because it's the right thing to do. And that's also why timing, I think, is important for us. For us, it's not just programs that we can put on a report. It's affecting a change in the people that we're allied with and that we're working with to maintain a peaceful society. I was with Ambassador Verveer recently in NATO, and I was asked the question, what can we do to help, after we'd made a presentation on where we were with the National Action Plan. And they said leadership by example. We have 70,000 women in theater in Afghanistan. No one else in ISAF comes close to that, either as a raw number or as a percentage. We have women in leadership there. The only thing that NATO has requested for our commander on the ground, General Allen, is a general officer gender advisor in NATO. These are the real things that set examples for our partner countries, not just, oh, we'll coax you to put a woman in a training seat by giving you an extra training seat. That's good. But the very same commander that instituted that, General Ham in Africa Command, sat in my office and he said, honestly, of all the things we're doing, what matters far more is when I bring Brigadier General so-and-so to meetings with me in Africa and they see where we put women in leadership positions in our country, and hey, we're the most powerful military in the world. Other countries want to emulate us. And so it's really our example, and that's been something that's been working over years. This National Action Plan, I think, though, very much has helped us to focus and maybe make it as a more specific objective when we're looking at our engagements with those countries. So I would say a very positive year for us, and that's my summary.
Great, thank you so much. And talking about effectiveness and how this type of policy has to be effective. It's not enough to be a policy, and to make it real is that setting example. Joan, what does it look like to the ground up?
Well, I'll tell you.
Relief and recovery.
Yeah. My initial assignment in 5 minutes was to give a short description of all 5 pillars and then take the 5th pillar and apply it to a current crisis. But I think Tori helped me out because I think she actually described the sort of 5 core pillars that make up the U.S. National Action Plan. I know we have a mixed group, people who have been very involved, some who are just coming to it initially. And I would really encourage you, if you're new to it, to take a look at the specifics under each pillar, because there are some very detailed things there, and I help think in terms of our mutual accountability and understanding where we want to go together. It's really a blueprint that we can hold one another accountable for implementing. We can look at budgets and programs and see if we see these things reflected there. So I'll just make that point. I think also when you were hearing Tori, you were probably also seeing how the different pillars relate one to the other and in a sense reinforce each other and are essential one to the other. Whether it's protection or promoting women's participation, they link up, yeah? So the 5th pillar, as Tori said, is access to relief and recovery. And so how is it that the US government is going to make sure that it's addressing the needs of women and children in its humanitarian assistance? How do you ensure safe and equal access? And I thought I would say, okay, well, let's take a look at the Mali crisis, for example. And just to say a few quick things about that, I mean, I think if you're following that, then you know that's really a full-blown political humanitarian security crisis. It's, and the thing of it is that, it really blew up about a year ago, and it blew up in a region that was at the time experiencing a massive food crisis affecting some 18 million people already in that region. And then this gets layered on it. I think if you obviously know about the armed insurrection in the north and the effort now to recapture that by the national government. But just to say that this conflict has displaced something like 400,000 people, either inside their own country or in very fragile neighboring countries. There's also an estimated, I think, 1 million people who aren't displaced, but have been affected to one degree or another by the conflict in the north.
I was looking at something from UNICEF the other day. Something like 600,000 kids are at risk of acute malnutrition. And then I think if you've looked at some of the reports from human rights organizations, you see reports of recruitment of child soldiers potentially, lots of horrific, I think, human rights violations, including attacks against women and girls, especially in the north. I think in any humanitarian crisis, as many of you know, especially during displacement, you'll see spikes in various kinds of violence against women and girls, including domestic violence. Also, the various issues around women and girls feeling they have to resort to sex in exchange for basic needs like food and so on. So if you think about Mali as a current example of large-scale humanitarian need, and you think about women and girls and the added vulnerability they have in these kinds of situations, then what does Pillar 5 of the National Action Plan say the U.S. is going to do in its own assistance programs? And I'll tell you, I mean, there's a series of things that you can go and look at, but I picked out 5 things that I just wanted to highlight. And the very first one is the U.S. government says that it's going to make sure that its humanitarian programs are designed and implemented with gender and protection in mind. And so it's like, okay, well, what does that really mean? And I thought, well, let's take food, for example. So you can deliver food, but how is it that you're assuring that women in particular have safe and equal access to it? So that means you have to intentionally think and decide and design a food distribution program to say, when is the food going to be delivered? How is it going to be delivered? At what time? Is it safe for women at that time? In what amounts? I mean, is it food that women can carry? What is the route from the distribution site to where they have to go back? Is it safe? So it's thinking about all of those kinds of things, or even something we've been working on. Say you give them the food, but what if it has to be cooked? And to cook it, they've got to go somewhere in an unsafe area and collect firewood. So it's really taking a look at the whole thing holistically and saying, how do you upfront design and implement a program that takes these things into account? That helps ensure safe and equal access. And I wanted to give a shout out to the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance because they've recently redone their guidelines. They just came out in October of 2012 and sort of looked at each of the different sectors and said, what are the considerations that have to be put in place by these different areas, whether it's food or water or shelter, to make sure you're thinking about gender and protection. So as the requests come in from Mali, they'll be looked at against this new criteria, which I think is great. Reproductive health care, if you're thinking about the needs of women and girls, then how do you get that reproductive health care out there at the very start of an emergency? The same with gender-based violence. I mean, I think that in virtually every conflict, it's going to happen to one degree or another in those early stages, and so get those services out there right away. Make sure they're in place from the get-go for survivors. It's one way to begin to get ahead of it and not have to play catch-up, and in the meantime have nothing available for people who may have been victimized. Economic empowerment, I think one great thing about the National Action Plan is that it looks at these different things and it recognizes that if you're thinking about how to prevent gender-based violence or how to enhance women's empowerment, you have to get at the economic issues. And that's true in relief operations too. If women don't have access to funds, they don't have access to needed assistance, then for all the reasons that you know, it puts them at added vulnerability. So I think you have to think from those early days, if it's cash assistance, what does it look like so that it safely reaches women? If it's different kinds of livelihood opportunities, are they appropriate for women? Are they safe for women? If women earn money, are they paid at times that are safe? If they take it home, do you have to think about some of the issues around domestic violence if the women can earn money and the men can't? So looking at all of those kinds of issues and thinking about it intentionally as you design your programs. A last point I wanted to make is that it comes up in one of the pillars, and I think it's really important in this one too, and it's saying that when the US government takes on these programs, when they have staff out there, they're going to be people who have been trained in these issues, in gender issues, in protection issues. And I think that's really critical because if those people are out there early in an emergency with the right kind of training, it increases the chances that these issues will be taken into account at the very beginning. They'll be included in those initial assessments. They'll be included in those initial funding appeals. And to me, it's as important for what the US does as for the advocacy it does with other donors and other actors in the field too. So I see that sort of USG capacity as informing our own programs, but also the advocacy we do with the UN system and so on. And I guess one last point I would just say, it also has to be owned, as Tori said, this whole body of work has to be owned by our diplomats as well. It's not just the folks who are immediately responsible for the relief programs, but it's our leadership as well, from the ambassador on down, conveying these same messages to our own people and to all our partners. So I'll stop there.
Great, Joan. And thanks for walking through, almost point by point, how to think through these problems. I think it's very useful to get at the concrete and what difference that does make in our analysis at the beginning, upstream and downstream. Rob, we're going to turn to you.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. Thank you, and thanks to USIP for hosting me. It's a pleasure to join all of you to take this opportunity to discuss what we've accomplished and the obstacles and what more remains to be done in terms of implementing Resolution 1325 and its family of follow-on resolutions. I want to step back for a minute and kind of give a little bit of perspective from the White House. I'm here to carry the message that as we enter the second term, and particularly as the President puts in place his second term leadership team, from the top down, there remains just a tremendously strong commitment to building a more inclusive approach to national security and more generally to empowering women and girls.
Excuse me, I think the mic is still on, and you might want to just turn it off while there is a transition. Thank you so much. I think it was mic 1.
That sounds nice.
Rob? Would you like to start all over?
So, as I was saying, just beyond the National Action Plan for just a minute, in terms of the approach that the President has taken since the first day, establishing the White House Council on Women and Girls, the Equal Futures Partnership that we launched last September to expand women's political and economic participation, the executive order that he directed that implements the U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally, to say nothing of the vast efforts that are coming out of the departments represented by the folks here on the panel with me today. We just continue to see this strong emphasis on what it means to put women and girls front and center within our foreign policy. I know part of the meaning of this meeting today is to celebrate some of the folks that we're going to lose within the administration shortly. But I can assure you that the President's underlying priorities on these issues haven't changed in the least. Along those lines, I have some very exciting news to share with everybody, but I'm going to wait for Ambassador Verveer, whom I hope is still showing up. If
I
she
think
doesn't,
she is coming.
great. If cliffhanger, I see some of you have your Blackberries out, so you may already know my exciting news. But we'll wait for Ambassador Verveer for a few more minutes on that front.
Tweet about your excitement.
Exactly.
There she is.
Welcome, Ambassador.
So just for a couple of minutes, and then I'll turn over the floor. From the perspective of the national security staff where I sit, where we come into play is translating these priorities into action. And obviously we know where the real action occurs. Folks like Ambassador Verveer, Carla, Bill, their staffs, the implementers and the members of the civil society working group. It happens through that advocacy and the teaching and the aid providers. So my role is effectively to ensure simply the feedback loop between the guidance givers on high and the actors actually working out in the field continues unabated to empower the empowerers. So that brings me to the progress we've made over the last year in implementing the U.S. National Action Plan. As you know, the action plan calls for an annual report to go to the President. We're working on that first annual report right now. All the government members of the panel, along with my boss, Samantha Power, actually met on this very topic yesterday. We've already heard some of the specifics, but there's no doubt in my mind or Samantha's mind or the mind of our leadership that we've used this year to pretty significant effect. So I want to just take a minute to work through the 5 guiding principles that led off the National Action Plan as something of a framework to talk about the progress we think we made. The first is centrality. Do we think the United States' efforts to bring women's perspectives to bear are central to the efforts we use to promote security? And the honest answer, I think, is we're certainly not all the way there yet, but we've amassed a momentum to the way we do business that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, and I think Bill put it pretty eloquently in terms of where DoD is and where it's been. This includes everything from the way our senior leaders engage with civil society when they go on high-level trips, to the way women, peace, and security now factors into the various plans that are being worked out of our embassies and USAID missions and combatant commands, to the manner in which we've advocated for the inclusion of this agenda in any number of multilateral fora, so NATO and the G8 and the UN. And we also heard this in President Obama's remarks at the podium with President Karzai earlier this month, and again with I'm not sure where we are these days, Senator Kerry, perhaps Secretary, I don't know, during his confirmation hearing. So second, are our efforts on women, peace, and security complementary to other initiatives to advance gender equality and women's empowerment, and to our humanitarian and human rights agendas more broadly? And I think the answer increasingly is yes, from the work being done on trafficking, as was mentioned, to our work on atrocity prevention and the rule of law and accountability, to food security and global health. What we've done over the course of the last year is really grown an interlocking and mutually reinforcing web of policies, and that gets at the mainstreaming point that we're all so involved in and so want to see occur, and really the way that will change the way we do business over the long run. Third is, are we guided by the principle of inclusion and seeking out members of marginalized groups, youth, women and girls, including those with disabilities, minorities, and LGBT persons? And I think, again, still a lot of work to do on this front in terms of better integrating the needs of vulnerable populations into everything we do. But we are working to ensure that our partners and our own staff know that we need to seek out these groups to ensure that they are at the table and their voices are heard, and that when our diplomats are out talking to their peers, elites aren't the only folks that serve as our interlocutors. The fourth point is, are we coordinated internally? And that is a really great question. If there's one thing I've learned in my 3 years at the NSC, it's that coordination is really darn hard. To be effective, it needs to happen in DC, it needs to happen in the embassies, it needs to happen in the combatant commands, it needs to happen both horizontally and vertically. And for, as was mentioned, an agenda as broad as that's encapsulated in the National Action Plan, it really just needs to happen across an astounding array of both country-specific contexts and thematic areas. So that's very much a work in progress. What I can say is, when you have an ambassador at large for global women's issues and a deputy assistant secretary of defense who are jointly briefing NATO, as Bill mentioned, when you have state and USAID jointly developing common indicators to track how our women, peace, and security related funding is spent and whether it's effective, and when you have embassies and combatant commands establishing gender working groups, we think we're on a pretty decent path for the time being, and one in which we can build on. And very lastly, are we holding ourselves accountable? This gets back to Sanam's point at the outset. From my vantage point, as the recipient of literally hundreds of pages of reports from these departments and others that aren't represented here today in terms of the different actions they're taking to implement the plan, I think the answer is we're trying. That's in part what this conversation today is about, and I don't want to overstate the progress that we're making, but we are, I think, doing an admirable job of holding ourselves to those commitments that were laid out in the plan in terms of accountability. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, and thank you, Rob. And well, their applaud is about how hard it is to coordinate. And that you bring out a very important part of the story is that it has to happen between building relationships as such, as we all have been working on for several years here around this agenda. Carla, we come to you now in our agenda, and of course we recognize Ambassador Verveer, who's joined us. We're moving through the panel here, and we're coming back to you. So Carla, please share with us what's been happening at USAID and progress made.
Well, first of all, thank you for the conversation and for organizing this opportunity for us to take stock. Joan and I were talking about when we were last on this stage, and that was way at the beginning when I'd first come in, and my story with regard to women, peace, and security is pretty different from Bill's, because I had been working on this for a long time with many of you, advocating for the creation of a national action plan, and going into the conversation that Rob mentioned yesterday, I was reflecting on where we are about 2 years later, and it's a pretty different world, I think, from where we were before. And it's pretty rare for somebody to be given that opportunity to advocate for something and then to make it real. So that's been a tremendous treat. For USAID, the implementation of the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security has been part of a broader process of overall reform. And I think it's safe to say that our architecture for working on gender equality and women's empowerment issues within AID has been wholly transformed over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years. Within that, we have embedded a commitment to issues relating to women, peace, and security writ large in all of the pillars of the National Action Plan. And so the extent to which a commitment to making these issues central moves forward is really consonant with how we're addressing gender issues in all that we do. And our fundamental premise is that doing justice to gender issues and women's empowerment issues in our development assistance and foreign aid work is essential to maximizing the effectiveness of our work writ large. So that has meant transforming policies and strategies, but it's also meant the creation of a whole set of indicators. It's also meant budgeting against those priorities. It's meant creating reporting requirements that deal not just with gender issues writ large, but then breaks those issues into different pieces related to gender-based violence, related to women's participation and leadership, related to the integration of gender equality and female empowerment in all that we do. It's meant creating the training programs that enable us to operationalize this all around the world, because we are a very, very decentralized organization, and it's not about Carla Coppell or a team of unbelievably capable individual gender experts moving this forward. It's about the agency being able to operationalize this as a set of individuals with different backgrounds and expertise. And so we're conducting that training. There's training this week taking place in Bangkok, but it's been over 500 people who have been trained so far, with online modules being rolled out in March. As we've been thinking about what this means concretely 1 year after the National Action Plan, what we've seen emerge are certain discrete programs, but also certain patterns. So one of the sets of programs that's really emerged quite strongly is the role that women play in mediation around the world and can play in mediating disputes. And often these disputes are not the kind you read about in the newspaper. They don't rise to that level, and in part they don't rise to that level because you have female mediators who are working to diffuse tension on the ground. And so we see emerging programs in Yemen, in Kenya, in Uganda, in Afghanistan, where women are mediating and successfully mediating on behalf of thousands of people and diffusing hundreds and hundreds of conflicts around the world. We've put aside funding for women's role in negotiation and women's leadership writ large, and we've seen how that's playing a role in places like Syria and Sri Lanka and the Philippines, and different missions reporting back into us about what effect that's having. We've looked at the role, we've seen emerge a whole set of interventions around women's roles in transition and the need to pay attention to their roles in transition and governance. And with that have seen the development of large new programs being developed, for example, around women's economic empowerment in Afghanistan and how essential that is to the transition there, but also to consolidating the advances that have been made for peace and security and women's rights in Afghanistan. We've seen programs in places like Sierra Leone that have focused on increasing the extent to which women are running for office. Over the last month, as part of our recognition of the first anniversary of the NAP, we've asked missions to hold conversations with women leaders, particularly those who are not already partners with our missions around the world. And it's been such a pleasure to read the reports coming back in from mission directors in far-flung places like Rwanda and Bosnia and the Philippines and Sri Lanka on the results of those conversations, sometimes done in partnership with ambassadors, sometimes ambassadors are doing them separately, and how those conversations will now be reflected in the programming that's going to take place on the ground. And to see the extent to which the folks on the ground are taking this seriously and how they're moving it forward is extremely edifying. And then the third piece that's emerging quite strongly is how we move our efforts to prevent and combat sexual and gender-based violence, and looking at how we integrate attention to those programs, particularly in situations of state fragility, where we see large new components of education programs in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Pakistan that show us that you can integrate attention into sector programs in ways that are going to, we hope, change the trend lines in terms of violence and how it runs its course within these societies around the world. So that's a very quick snapshot, and you'll hear more as we complete this process of doing a review with regard to what's going on. But for those who know me well, and there are many of you in the room, I'm sort of all about what's coming next. And I just think it's useful for you I wanted to unpack really quickly some of the things we're thinking about as we move forward. And I think, and so to give you that list, I mean, I think we're thinking about how do you scale up and how do you replicate. We have these discrete interventions in different places, but often they're a few hundred people when they could be a few thousand or a few 100,000 that we're working with. So how do we do that, and how do we carry our successes from one place to another? Rob mentioned it, but I think how we further weave and integrate this agenda into our agendas around countering violent extremism, and Tori mentioned that earlier, around atrocity prevention, around counter narcotics, and around conflict prevention writ large. We're focused, and Ambassador Verveer and I have spoken about this, on how you do the handoff. So what is the role of different entities, and then how do you make sure that AID is doing its job and then passing the baton to others and carrying that, and vice versa, and how do you carry that forward? We've also spoken about how you make it turn from retail to wholesale. So rather than convincing one person at a time, how do you really capture the imagination and the commitment of many, many people and really become transformative and reach that tipping point? And then finally, when you're thinking about large-scale infrastructure programs in a fragile environment, how do you really integrate gender issues into your planning process so that you're laying the kind of foundation for peace and prosperity that is wholly inclusive? So that gives you a very quick landscape, but I hope what it reveals to you is that we're thinking a lot about this, and we're trying to think about it in ways that are comprehensive and strategic. And I think it's been a terrific first year of new initiatives and new partners and collaborative efforts, and I really look forward to seeing how this becomes more robust, more comprehensive, with greater effect as the years go on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carla. Appreciate that, because you bring new nuance to the term overall reform. I mean, it is not just a reform at the government and in the policy, but really the actions that come through there. So I appreciate you spelling that out. And now I'm going to turn to my colleague here, Chantal, to see if you could wrap up this part of the conversation before we turn to Ambassador Verveer.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. I think there's a lot of interesting things that have been said. But I'd like to remind everybody that this is really a celebratory event. We celebrate the first year anniversary of the NAP. We celebrate civil society and government cooperation this past year. We celebrate and showcase the breadth and depth of knowledge and experience of civil society actors. And I think we prepare ourselves because the hard work actually starts now with the implementation of the NAP. Now I want to say a few things, but before I do that, I would also like to thank, on behalf of the whole civil society working group, I would like to thank USIP, and in particular the director of the Center for Peacebuilding and Gender, Kathleen Keenest. USIP has provided us with now, for about 2 years, I would say, with a safe and neutral space in which civil society can come together and in which civil society can talk to government and consult with government. And I think that has been an extremely positive development for all of us. And it was really in an atmosphere of trust and constructive dialogue. But I think we also have to recognize the leadership of Kathleen Keenest, the director of the Center for Gender and Peacebuilding. She has really kept us together. She's kept us focused, and she always keeps us moving forward. So on behalf of the group, thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, USIP. Now, back to the substance. I'd like to make a few remarks. I think, first of all, and Sanam mentioned this in the beginning, is that 1325 is not a resolution about women and gender per se, but it's really a resolution that is about how best to establish and maintain peace and security. And I think through this resolution, members of the UN Security Council recognized that we needed to be more attentive to the effects of our policies on different groups in societies. The member states, I think, recognized that we needed to be smarter when using our policy tools, whether these are coercive tools such as the use of force or economic sanctions, or whether these are cooperative tools such as peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, or post-conflict reconstruction relief. Now, being smarter, I think, means that we have to recognize that the policy tools may have different effects on different groups in society, and in particular on men and women. Violent conflict, wars, change gender relations, changes needs and capabilities and capacities, and policymakers and civil society actors active in these environments need to recognize these changes, because failure to do so means that your policy falls flat or that it backfires. Now, this might seem self-evident, yet our conceptual tools to understand international relations often take issues at face value, and we often think that we're sort of engaged in a gender-neutral environment. The second point I'd like to emphasize has to do with protection and the issue of sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict situations. I think there are different ways of looking at this issue. One can see this as a horrible crime that is committed by and to individuals. One can see this as a weapon of war, or one can see this as a manifestation, a symptom of patterns of domination within societies. And for me, it's really the latter that requires us to mobilize. We need not only deal with the physical and psychological aftermath, we need not only allow for redress and fight impunity, but we also need to tackle the underlying causes. And in that sense, the prevention of sexual violence is central to conflict prevention and peace building. And I would like to congratulate Ambassador Verveer, and I think also the UK government, for making this issue really a top priority internationally. I'd also like to invite you to a 3-day symposium that some of us are organizing here at USIP, February 14th to 16th, and you can follow the proceedings of this symposium through the web. The third point I would like to make is that implementation is really difficult, and I think Rob alluded to this. The integration of gender perspectives into our policies, both at a governmental and at a non-governmental level, are fraught with difficulties. What are some of these difficulties? First, I think we lack the conceptual frameworks. These issues are not on the mainstream of international relations or security studies. And I think the academics and think tankers have been really underperforming in this regard. Second, we lack strong, systematic, empirical data to infuse our policy making or to inform best practices. Third, we lack resources. And fourth, and this is important, I think, as well, is we're often too impatient, and we often lack commitment to the long term. Now, I think these difficulties should not lead us to drop our hands in despair and say, oh, what can we do about this? I think they should lead us to have realistic expectations, to work harder, because there is ad hoc accumulating evidence that the empowerment of women bring a lot of positive outcomes and will also often bring different perspectives and priorities to negotiating tables. Finally, my fourth point is that we, civil society, government, academics, think tanks, the private sector, we need to work together, not to co-opt each other, but I think to learn from each other and to hold each other accountable. I think if we want to succeed, we need to break out of our silos, our development silo, our foreign policy silo, our academic silos, our defense silo. Again, I think this seems self-evident, but it is very hard to do, to have an integrated policy, in part because we don't have the type of cross-cutting or integrated authority structures. But I think here again, the National Action Plan, the NAP, and the US Civil Society Working Group are powerful, new, and innovative policy instruments that can help with greater and better integration, and that can help keep us all accountable to the ultimate goal, which is peace and security. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chantal. And thank you for rounding out the conversation about peace and security, because sometimes it does become a second part of the story in our trying to integrate women. And thank you for your call out as well. Ambassador, welcome. Thank you. We understand you've had a really busy day. And we appreciate that you could join us here today. We'd love to hear from you. We've set the scene. I think everyone has done an excellent job of bringing the various issues from both civil society and the US government in terms of the US NAP. And we'd love to hear about what it has been to lead this effort and what you see as next.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you to everyone associated with USIP. You have been there from the earliest days, urging us on, as much of civil society present in this room has, to finally have a US National Action Plan. And it wouldn't have happened without the hard work, the road that you prepared, the kind of persistent efforts that you made, and the cajoling of us to once and for all get it done. And I want to thank also the representatives of other governments who are here in the room who led the way with their national action plans and couldn't have been more grateful when we finally did it, that we joined the club, so to speak. But it's really important, and I really want to say that, and I want to apologize for being late. As you alluded to, it's a very busy time over at the State Department. We're less than 48 hours away from the Secretary's departure and from a major transition and a new Secretary coming in. And I think the most important message I want to convey today is that this issue does not end in the State Department with the departure of one Secretary who's been an incredible champion, but continues with the incoming Secretary-designate, who, if any of you followed his confirmation hearings, as Rob alluded to, remarked that only the night before his hearing he was reading the National Action Plan. And I hope it didn't put him to sleep, but he seemed exceptionally well informed, and I have no doubt from what he has said to us and to others that he will continue ensuring that in our diplomatic efforts, what the NAP represents is fully included in all of our efforts bilaterally and multilaterally, and that we will continue to work with our colleagues at USAID and DOD and the other agencies who are real parties to all of this. So that journey continues, and what we have seen, and I agree with you, Chantel, even though the road is far from fully completed, and we are all on this journey in so many different ways, there is much to celebrate in having reached this point and the kind of appreciation for what this is. And I like very much with what you said about what this is really about. It is about integration in all that we do. And so many of our colleagues here from different departments and bureaus and offices at state, for example, are integrating this not as something that's a separate add-on, not for some ideological reason, not because somebody has beat them over the head and said you need to do this, but because this makes us effective, more effective in what we are all trying to achieve in our overall diplomatic mission, whether that's through our economic bureau or whether it's through political military or whether it's through the folks who are fighting terrorism or the folks who are trying to stabilize on the ground. This really makes us that much more effective, and at its foundation, that's what this is about, and that's why no matter how difficult integration and coordination is, it is essential, because ultimately you can't get from here to there without it. Secondly, what we are doing on the interagency and within department levels is also being done on the multilateral level, and that's been particularly inspirational in many ways. The welcoming of the United States into these efforts in which so many others have led. I know Bill talked about NATO, which celebrated its first anniversary last year in terms of the kind of commitment it's making, what Norway has done to provide a gender expert to NATO, what the United Kingdom is doing on sexual gender-based violence, and putting that very high up on the G8 agenda as they take over the G8 process for this coming year. So you see this really beginning to have the kind of impact across the board beyond what we are all trying to do with our colleagues in our respective agencies. I just want to not focus so much on the what and the points that are included in everything that's been happening over the last year, but really to give you a little bit of the images that I have revolving in my head of people I have met all over the world who are struggling really hard to get to a different place, and why this matters. Carla and I and our colleague from MEPI, our Middle East Partnership Initiative, just came back from Doha over the weekend, where we met with some extraordinary Syrian women activists. They came from within Syria. They came from where they were pushed to in Turkey and Jordan, but what they had in common was a determination to try to impact the outcome, hopefully soon, that would take their country to a different place. And before their work concluded, they had put together a series of recommendations for the international community, for us in particular, and it had a lot to do with the necessity to have people like them, their voices, their perspectives, their experiences present in all of the international discussions that are taking place, whether they have to do with humanitarian assistance or they have to do with the potential political future. And so this matters for them. And then we had an incredible breakthrough today at the African Union with the news that former President Mbeki, who was heading the process, announced that South Sudan women and Sudanese women will now be part of the high implementation panel, which I think is a major breakthrough to try to bring about the kind of change that has been too long in coming. Hopefully this will begin to make a difference. And again, I want to thank civil society because inclusive security was so active in that process. I was also thinking about those women who come around a table in places that seem far removed from the front pages, but are still dealing with conflict that has racked their lives, and their situations still aren't being addressed. I was in the Republic of Georgia not too long ago, and in that boundary line with South Ossetia and Abkhazia, place we don't much think about, I'm sure many of us, there is a process that hasn't really gone very far to solving the problems, but people are living their everyday lives there. And I sat with a group of Azari women, Armenian women, and Georgian women. And one of them looked up from the discussion. They were so proud that with great difficulty, they were trying to cross the divisions and address some of the problems that really bear on their everyday lives, and if not addressed, will make the situation so much worse. And one woman looked me in the eye and she said, "This is hard work." And it is hard work. But to have had the US ambassador sitting there with them, to have had a representative of the European Union Monitoring Office, which has a strong gender component, part of the discussion, really makes a difference and makes one appreciate the fact that we can indeed make progress in places like that. I think too of the women I sat with in Burma, and everybody wants to usher in and hope for a better future for a place and a people that have been isolated for so long from much of the world. But Burma will never embrace that new future unless its ethnic problems are solved. And the ethnic situation will not be solved in all the myriad places where it is an issue unless women are also at the table. And so the work is going on there in ways that are bringing the women in to ensure that what they know about that's been happening on the ground that has to be addressed. You can have a truce and an end to the conflict, and everybody wants that. But then the hard work of that peace agreement and what goes in it and whether the real issues are addressed so it's not abrogated a year later or not long after will really matter. So in a place like Burma, people don't think very much about how this affects it, but it does. And then, of course, Afghanistan is ever with us in so many different ways. And I have to tell you that we have all worked, and you have worked with us to ensure women's participation in the international conferences, to ensure the kind of progress that Carla talked about. Nobody wants to see any going back, and everybody knows that there will be no sustainable peace if that potential is to be realized, if women are not part of the process, if they're sidelined. And what it was to be in Tokyo for the last international conference on Afghanistan, where a mutual accountability framework was adopted. And all of the major countries that are involved through the ISAF effort, as well as the Afghan leaders, were there to talk about our mutual commitment as we signed this mutual accountability framework, the Afghans' commitment to address some of the very serious issues that we all know about, and commitments that we will continue to make in terms of our development, in terms of our military training, police training, et cetera. But what was so striking was that foreign minister after foreign minister, when they took the microphone for their country, just about every single one said to the Afghan leaders, a top priority for us is the future of the women of Afghanistan, the role they will play in the peace process, and the role they need to continue to play in society. Now, we don't know where this is headed, but that kind of resonance and consistency of voice from the broader coalition, I think is something that gives us all hope that as we continue to work together, civil society prodding our governments, government doing what it needs to do, that we will see the kind of effectiveness in the outcomes that we all want to see. And I just want to conclude by telling you something that is not exactly about why we're gathered here today, but I think is something to celebrate. It happened just a few hours ago when the President told the Secretary of State that he was signing a presidential memorandum to make an ambassador for global women's issues permanent in the United States.
Very good. We do what we can.
So the reason that I sit here is because many of you long lobbied for this to happen. And we are very grateful, all of us, to the leadership that the President gave to this, to his commitment to it, and to the fact that in the second Obama administration, as the next term comes into the reality, that this will continue to be both a strong commitment in terms of the work we've been doing in the Office of Global Women's Issues, but on this issue in particular, what Rob's presence represents here, a commitment across across the administration, across the government, that the United States will continue to be there. And we will only be as good as all of you continue to urge us on. And our lasting gift to all of you is the tools, the instruments that you now have.
Thank you, Ambassador, and also thank you for bringing such good news along with you today. We have just a little bit of time in our program for Q&A from the audience before our concluding remarks, and then we're going to break for the resource and knowledge fair. So what I'm going to do is ask for about 2 or 3 questions that you address to the panelists, and then we'll keep this moving along. And I see our first audience participant there. Jackie, will you introduce yourself?
I got so excited I stood up.
Organization.
Hi, I'm Jackie O'Neill, the Director of Inclusive Security. I want to thank all of you for your remarks today and for all the work that each of you has done to get us to today, and especially Ambassador Verveer for your service. You really helped set a tone of really genuine collaboration between civil society and government that we deeply appreciate and will miss. My question is for each of our representatives from government. You mentioned some great accomplishments that you're especially proud of, or areas of progress. And I'm wondering if you could identify maybe one area that you think might be at greatest risk of possibly backsliding over the next year. Not necessarily because we know we're going to lose some champions, Ambassador Verveer and Secretary Clinton and others, but maybe just because we on the outside think it maybe is more secure of a game than it really is, or maybe more secure in its position. So in other words, what are some of the areas that we as civil society need to be especially vigilant about not taking for granted over the next year? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jackie. Is there another question? Just, we don't have much time, so if you want another question, okay, thank you very much. No, well, no, we have,
You have a mic.
A
Thank you.
moment, so thank you.
One of the areas, I'm Mindy Reiser, I'm Vice President of Global Peace Services. One of the areas where women could have a greater presence is in policing, There have been difficulties in recruiting them for international missions. There aren't that many women in senior positions in police forces in the US. I wonder if any of you can speak to that and what we could do to encourage their role. They're really important on the ground, and they're a role model for police forces in other countries.
Great, thank you. And one more question right here.
Thank you. I'm Helena Grunberg with the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, a program partner of Sanam's organization, the International Civil Society Action Network. Thank you to all the panelists and also to USIP for this great event. My question is very specifically to Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. You mentioned, or you said in your remarks, that the National Action Plan has focused attention, and then you mentioned inclusion into school curriculum. I would like to hear a little bit more about that, if you can. I think peace education is such an integral part to the maintenance of international peace and security, and it starts right here. So what is being done here in terms of integration into school curriculums?
And I'm going to take the last question right up here, and then I'm going to open it up to our panel.
Hi, my name is Iman Al-Tamimi. I'm a student. I'm also from Iraq. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. Thank you, Ambassador Verveer, for the wonderful, great news. I believe that will have a great impact on the future of women. My question is the challenge that now women in Iraq and Syria is facing. The Iraqi women the detainees and Iraqi prisoners, that was a challenge from the beginning, and unfortunately didn't have the solution or the touchable solution that we see such a miserable situation can have an end. Besides the situation for Syrian women in Jordanian camps, that also was going on until like last week. The Daily Telegraph put the report about what the Syrian refugees are suffering in these refugee camps. Is there any kind of like vision or ideas that can help stop the suffer for women in Iraqi prisons and Syrian women in Jordanian camp refugees? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And now to bring it back to the panelists, and I actually think I'm going to just ask you to, each one of you, respond to which question. There's too many of us and a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask Ambassador Verveer, will you begin? Very brief comments, and I'm going to just move right through the panel before we get to the concluding remarks.
Well, just very briefly, I think the question about policing and attracting more women to that is something we're trying to do, for example, with the Afghan National Police, to get those numbers up and to be very strategically involved in the training and in making it possible despite the constraints. You know, when the very famous Indian peacekeeping force in Liberia, the all-female force, was so instrumental in modeling the fact that women could indeed do whether peacekeeping or policing. In the case of Liberia, many more women were recruited into policing, which is so important there in a post-conflict setting. So that makes a difference. And the United States has invested significantly in some of these areas of conflict in really both stressing the need for more women to be engaged in policing and then providing resources to that end, particularly for the training. In terms of Iraq and the camps, I don't know if that was directly for you, Bill, but I'll just... camp situation is very grim. Two of our colleagues were there over the weekend in Jordan sending us reports. The numbers keep growing. The international community, including the United States, is responding with greater resources. but it is a crisis, and I don't know how else to describe it. We had a discussion when we were with the Syrian women about violence in the camps. This is often an issue, regrettably, that occurs in these settings, and they're ones where we have more often than not raised our voices about the need to have those conditions addressed. And I know that in Iraq, many women who are subject of violence, the safe place where they find themselves, believe it or not, is in prison, as you, I think, were indicating. And so to find safe places for them, the kind of shelters that we need to see far more significantly made available, is something that is desperately needed.
Thank you, and I'm just going to, Sanam, these are kind of concluding remarks as well.
Okay. So on the policing front, in 2005, I think, I was in a workshop with women from ex-militias, ex-armed groups in Africa. And it was extraordinary. These were incredibly skilled women. They had joined armed groups because of ideological liberation movement type issues, and they've been completely forgotten. And South Africans, I mean, South Africans who fought against apartheid ended up going into prostitution while their male colleagues became known, sort of moved up in the ranks of the military and so forth. So I think that one of the things is, where are we doing the recruiting for women police and women peacekeepers? Because there are plenty of women who have the experiences, but I don't think that we're going to the right places for them, frankly. And part of it is that it's an old boys network, and if you become a peacekeeper, police officer, you get paid better and so forth. And so there's a nice little sort of thing that goes on with the men. But it's really the outreach that needs to happen, which I think is really important. But there's another piece of this as well. We should not be relying on women police officers to provide protection for women in communities. I think that the question is, are we doing proper training? Are we giving police officers the training to say, you are providing a service to your community. You're not there to exert force. Just because you have a uniform doesn't give you more power to exert force and actually be a source of harassment, which is one of the huge problems that we have in the world. And one of the things that at ICANN we've talked to our partners about is actually having a women's security campaign where we say, let's work with women's civil society and community groups to say, stop sexual and gender-based violence. Will you, as police of my country, sign up to a charter that says you will not perpetrate sexual and gender-based violence and you will prevent sexual and gender-based violence? Can you imagine a police force not signing up to that, right? And if they do, well, the accountability is from the ground up as well as from the international. So we have to think about creative ways of making existing police forces accountable. On the Middle East, ICANN has a whole MENA region program. We are producing these briefs called Women, What the Women Say, and actually on Syria and on Iraq, they're out there with many of the issues and the recommendations that come from the voices of women on the ground. So I would suggest that you
so they'll be able to find those
they can find those there. And in the camps, one of the problems that we have is that men aren't getting jobs. So the frustration and the emasculation that they feel is coming out as violence against women. So we need to give men in the camps jobs and some sense of dignity and so forth. So that there's a whole relationship issue that I think is important at that level.
I think we have
Concluding
to
remarks, I'm going to leave it there. I have too many things to say.
The conversation will continue afterwards. Bill?
I guess I'll start with a specific question that was for DoD on schools and move to the more general backsliding problem. On the schools, two different issues, and in fact, even among us, we often merge the two because we got the 5 pillars, and each pillar really has a very different objective. So our schools, we're talking about both training of DoD internally, and then also the schools that we run with respect to our allies and our partners in the various regions. So at the top, kind of, we have our war college level schools for lieutenant colonels and colonels, future generals. National War College is developing a curriculum on women, peace, and security, pulling data right now to support some of the underpinnings of our women, peace, and security programs. Naval War College specifically has developed a women, peace, and security program. And then we have, of course, then you get to the more rudimentary level of the sexual and gender-based violence and our own internal problems. And that's the interesting thing about DoD, unlike some of the other departments and agencies, where the appropriate balance point for us is still underway. Just on the 24th of January, Secretary Panetta announced the removal of the combat exclusion. But that's not a finished project. You know, that they have until, the services have till 2016, not to figure out how progressive we're going to be. I think that's the wrong way to look at it, but to figure out what's the right answer. How do we want to balance our forces? And so internally, we have our own training programs to make sure we're hitting that right. And then our regional centers and those curricula that we bring in our partners to have a specific gender-based focus in greater and greater quantity. And I have to say part of that is just a quick comment. In Sanam's original comments, she reflected on this not being just a bureaucratic burden. I only remember that because I'm reflecting on the piece of this that was a bureaucratic burden. As we were having to answer the mail from the White House, Sarah would come and tell me that, oh, this guy Rob Brzezinski keeps saying you got to get your report in on time. And yes, there is a piece of it that's a bureaucratic burden, but there's a benefit to even that part of the bureaucratic burden because it gives us that focused attention that allows us to say, hey, are we, in fact, putting these things in the curricula that we can? The difficult part is when you get to the more recondite pieces of this, where we're teaching at our top level schools how we are, in fact, helping to have a sustainable peace by the enfranchisement of a significant portion of the population that might have been left out. That, we're looking at the analytical work that still, I think, could be benefited by, it could continue to be done. And that's, I guess, how I would also respond to the question about the backslide. I don't know if it's backsliding, but I think it's the challenges for the future. When we look at, hey, what did we do this year that we didn't do last year? Well, we've all been through that exercise, and we can identify many things. But when we really have to look at what are the metrics going to be that we use, it's easy to throw out numbers. You know, I got 220,000 jobs currently not open to women right now in the military. I made that number up, don't quote. It's somewhere in 220 to 250,000. That's a scary part.
Sorry. Don't tweet that.
It's not that, but I'm not saying what it is. But those are easy metrics, and when you're at the beginning of a process like this, it's easy to identify those metrics. I think our challenge is going to be really identifying where are we drawing the line on what we're trying to accomplish. Are we going to say, well, the world is more peaceful, and therefore we've been successful, or something in between, simply enfranchising a numerical figure for women and a more peaceful world? And that's that, in looking at our counterinsurgency training and things like that and fitting women, peace, and security into it, that's where the challenges and that's where the difficulty will be. And yes, Secretary Panetta will be reading his National Action Plan tonight so that he can answer the same way Secretary Kerry did. But if you don't hear that answer, it's just because he didn't say that in the hearings. It's not because he didn't read the plan tonight.
We have run to just the outer limits of our time, and I'm going to ask our remaining panelists to forgive me, but is there one comment that you want to make in brief before we have to get to our
I'll make one about backsliding. I feel like as an advocate, I have to say this. I could picture that in a time of greatly diminished resources, there's a temptation to say, can't do this, can't afford it. And I think all of us understand in this room, it's about doing the work we're doing really well. And it's not only about money, although money is a piece of it. And so I think for all of us that are behind this agenda, it's reminding people that there are certain things we're going to have to do, even in an era of constrained resources, and really keep our eye on that prize, I think.
I'll just piggyback really quickly on the backsliding question, although I agree with Desi Litzau that we should frame it as a challenge. Just in terms of this great announcement and the President's memorandum that we heard about from Ambassador Verveer, obviously a huge testament to what she and Secretary Clinton have accomplished and the President's recognition that this office needs to be maintained. It needs to have someone at the level we've had over the course of the last 4 years, and the office itself needs to be maintained at the level in terms of its direct communication with the Secretary. It also very much highlights the role that Carla has played within USAID and the need to maintain a position that has direct access to the USAID administrator, and sets up an interagency framework, and I say this as the integration guy, that means that women, peace, and security and women's empowerment and gender equality in general continue to be on the agenda across the interagency. So I think that's just a tremendous statement in terms of not backsliding, and something that we can really all look forward to.
Really great. Carla?
My final comment will be a cross between a comment and an answer, and it really is to salute the partnership between civil society and government. And I think that that's been essential to getting us to where we are now and will remain essential moving forward, particularly when you look at the departments and agencies represented here. We work in far-flung locations all around the world, and the ability for us to move this forward in a concerted way all around the world depends on all of you working with our field missions, with our ambassadors, with our combatant commands, and thinking about how to help us move this out, because we really are the internal advocates that work in partnership with all of you outside of government.
Well said.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Carla's comment, and I think we have a lot of hard work ahead of us.
But we're celebrating today. Well,
but it's a celebration.
It is a celebration, and with this, I hope you will all join me in thanking our panelists for their excellent insights and elaboration. And before we go to the Great Hall, we have a final concluding remarks here. So I'm going to ask, just for the sake of time, I think we're going to just stay right here. And I'm going to take the podium for a moment. In our concluding remarks today, take a special path that brings us to you, Ambassador Verveer.
Surprise, this is your life.
As a colleague, leader, friend, and as someone who has really inspired women and men around the world, we recognize that you are concluding one great chapter of a notable career and about to begin another. And so, Ambassador, we'd like to just say a few words of appreciation, and I'm going to call upon Bill Lietzau to start us off here, and we'll have a few others who are going to join us. So maybe since you're sitting there, or would you like to come?
I'd be happy to sit.
Please sit, and don't say too much.
I won't say too much because I understand too the limits of time. And there are others here who've had much greater experience, and I don't know if they would have greater appreciation though for Ambassador Verveer than do I. You all had the opportunity to hear about my extensive background in this subject. And so you can imagine how disturbing it was to find out that the ambassador at large for global women's issues wanted me to go brief NATO with her on these issues. And I thought she probably has a more extensive background than I do. And in fact, she does, but she has more than that. It was, in fact, I also remember sitting, I have to just share this because I remember the moment, I'll never forget it. We didn't really know how all the meetings were going to pan out, but we ended up briefing the North Atlantic Council with the Secretary General of NATO, introducing each of us in order to give the remarks that all the ambassadors had come to hear. And she whispered to me, "Oh, I didn't know this was going to be that big a deal." The agreement had been that she would comment. I was on a listening tour to get spun up for this project. But it was clear that we both then had to speak. And what she doesn't realize is I just kept looking over her shoulder the whole time at her remarks, trying to copy ones down for myself to use. So in that way, I will always think of you, Ambassador Verveer, when I think about this topic. But more importantly, because as you all know, there is no more perfect person to fill this role. The passion she has for it, but the down-to-earth nature, it makes me, Kipling, it was said, who can, I shouldn't use that, can talk with crowds and keep their virtue, walk with kings and keep the common touch. Of course, I know I just quoted a poem that ends with, "You'll be a man, my son." And it hit me of all places. Obviously, I need more training, but that is Ambassador Verveer. She does all of that. She works at the top levels and right down to where it matters, and you can see that in her heart, and it inspires people like us, and I do mean that.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you for what you've done.
From our civil society member here, Karen Mulhauser, who is the president of the UN Association here in DC. Karen.
Well, it is an extreme honor to have been asked to represent the Civil Society Working Group to say a few remarks about Ambassador Milan Verveer. This is indeed a celebration. It's a celebration of an extraordinary effort. This Civil Society Working Group that's been meeting for about 2.5 years has brought together some amazing people. And the integrator, is that what you called yourself?
The integrator.
Integration between government and civil society was a masterful job, and we have been meeting throughout this last year with government, and there is no one who personifies the partnership between government and civil society the way Milan Verveer does. I've known her since the mid-'80s when she was the executive vice president of People for American Way, and she was teaching us all how to build a movement. And so it was an honor for me to be able to say I knew the First Lady's chief of staff when she went into the White House. And she brought civil society instincts and understandings and experience into the White House. And then she jumped back into civil society and started Vital Voices and brought all her lessons from government into civil society. And then she zigzagged back into government, where we all, I won't go into more detail because we all know the extraordinary job that she has done as the ambassador. And on behalf of the Civil Society Working Group, we're eager to welcome you back to civil society. And I don't know if all of you were checking your Blackberries, but I did get a notice today. You did not mention it, but her transition back into civil society, she is executive director designate of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. We appreciate all the experience you'll bring to us. And we'd love for you to be an active member of our working group.
Well, we're very happy that Deputy Administrator Donald Steinberg was able to join us. He's had a very busy afternoon as well. And Don, I know you have some comments here, and we want to welcome you to this event today. Always great to have you.
I always like being introduced as the Deputy Administrator for AID when in reality we all know what my real job is, and that is Special Assistant to Ambassador Verveer. She has had access to the AID checkbook ever since I got to AID.
True. Don't do that either.
And let me just say in all seriousness, I just came from a meeting at the White House where we were talking about Syria, and part of what we were talking about is how to use the $155 million that the president announced for additional assistance within Syria for internally displaced people and outside of Syria in the refugee camps to assist women to create livelihoods, to work on girls' education, and to address issues of gender and sexual-based violence in that space. And frankly, I don't think this issue would have risen to that kind of an agenda if it were not for Milan. I want to tell just two quick stories. I had the pleasure of testifying with Milan, working with her in her tenure as the First Lady's Chief of Staff. But I really didn't know her on a personal basis until I came to work for USAID. And 2 weeks after I arrived, Milan and I were at the United Nations looking over the speech that Secretary Clinton was about to give on the 10th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325. And the speech was great. Milan had worked very hard on it. And then at one point we were reading sort of the punchline, which was that the United States would plan to support programs for Resolution 1325. And Milan looked at me, and she looked at everyone else in the room and said, why don't we just announce that we're going to do a national action plan? And we all looked at each other and said, yeah, let's do that. And that is the true story of how, a decade later, and I always regret that decade, but how we made the determination. And then it was Milan who said, yeah, and let's commit it to do it by, a year from now, and then let's commit to have national action plan, implementation plan. And I said, wait a second, one step at a time. But that can-do attitude is what we all love about Milan, and what makes us, and I just choked up a little bit, but what makes us choke up in thinking about her moving on. The other story I wanted to tell was something that she's totally unaware of, which is embarrassing, don't worry. When I first got to AID, Milan came over and was talking about some problems that we were seeing around the world with domestic violence. And she said, in particular, the Secretary is very ginned up about Central America. And so one of the things that we did over the course of the last few years was put together a variety of programs to address domestic violence in Central America. And I had the pleasure of going down to Honduras and Mexico and Guatemala about 6-8 weeks ago, and to look at one of the programs that we were implementing. And I always have worried in my role at AID whether we're really having an impact on the ground. I've said, are we keeping one woman from being raped in the Eastern Congo? Are we preventing acid being thrown in the face of a girl for daring to return to school in Afghanistan? And so we went out to a small village called Ashish, and we met with a group of indigenous women who we were supporting, who were fighting against domestic violence. And it was one of the most remarkable sessions that I've been in. These women, many of whom were illiterate, many of whom had never advocated on behalf of any issue, were a power. And they were changing attitudes in their village. They were changing attitudes domestically throughout Guatemala, and I believe throughout the whole region. But what I remember most was one man who stood up at the end. And he said, when I was growing up as a young boy, I used to watch my dad beat my mom. And I felt emasculated. I felt powerless to do anything about it. And so when I grew up with this as my model, I started beating my wife. And that's how I demonstrated who I am as a person and who I am as a man. He said, a couple years ago, my wife gave birth. And I sat with the boy in my hand, in my arms, and I thought about what I've learned in this group. And I said, it stops with me. It will not go on. It stops with me. So Milan, there are no indispensable people in the world, but you come damn close. And thank you on behalf of USAID. Thank you on behalf of the women and men of the world. And thank you on behalf of that young boy in Guatemala.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, Don. We have one last tribute here, and I've asked Tori if she would say a few words on behalf of the State Department. Tori.
Well, it's hard to top all that, but and I can't, but on behalf of many of my colleagues at State Department, I just wanted to talk about, we want to revise the National Action Plan. We're going to relate it directly to what we've experienced from Ambassador Verveer. So instead, the 3 Ps will be passionate, professional, and persistent, because she is all 3. Her passion shows through every day in her get up and go out and argue with another regional office about why this matters. Her persistence is that she even cares about the details beyond probably anybody else I know about how peacekeeping training at the tactical level matters for SGBV down the road, not just in Eastern Congo, but around the world. And I have had such an impressive relationship because of her commitment to this and her patience with working through the details. And her professionalism, I'm sure, is well beyond what I've seen in dealing with the international community when she's doing her diplomatic work. But I recall very well, we had flown to a country together once. The secretary was leading a delegation. It's a very important country. It's when the relationship really matters. We had a sort of working group, and she was fabulous and came and talked to the issues. But it was the next day that struck me. This beautiful gilded room, 250 people. The agenda item of Women, Peace, and Security had been refused by the other country. So at the very end, the secretary, very senior people at the table, I'm in the behind. Also, the secretary says, one more issue, sir. And he calls the ambassador up to the table. The look of surprise on the other side, I was like, oh, what's this? A little tribute to us, thank you for the food, whatever. And she starts talking about women, peace, and security. And the look on the faces of the diplomats, there's clearly no woman. There's maybe one woman on the other side of the table. And she just marches on. She just lays it out there, very charming, very clear, very persistent, very professional. And on the other side of the table, the very senior person finally says, well, we have plenty of advice from women. We all have wives.
That's right, that's right.
Demonstrating in an instant how important it was that you were at the table and that we continue the conversation worldwide. There's so many times that I never saw that, but that you did that. And that's what we have so much to thank you for. So I really appreciate being able to work with you. I think all my peers feel the same way, up and down throughout the State Department, high and low. And I was reminded of this when anybody driving to work this morning heard NPR, heard the secretary interviewed on what she accomplished. And one of the things she said was the work on women and girls. And you are the personification of that.
Well,
so
thank you.
Before we leave the hall here into that hall for cookies and celebration and to visit the 24 tables of our civil society working group members, all of us here today in this audience want to congratulate you, Ambassador, on a job really well done and wish you the very best in your next endeavor. So we've said a lot here today, but sometimes it's just the action that counts. And so I hope you will join me in a round of great applause and appreciation of Ambassador.